Sarcasm is really leading to a deeper understanding and thinking. You have to understand what's underneath the surface meaning to appreciate the intended meaning. And so all of these examples are about depth of thought.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 174th episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to improve the workings of your brain and the processes thereof. In this case, in this episode, we're going to be talking very specifically about creativity. Creativity is one of those universally adored traits. Pretty much everybody out there either wishes they were creative or is very glad that they are. And I think probably everyone is to one extent or another. A lot of people aren't comfortable with their own creativity, but we're all somewhere on that creative spectrum. I think creativity, actually, the definition is probably a lot like intelligence. The ability to come up with solutions to novel problems doesn't necessarily mean that you're busting out oil paintings in your free time or anything like that, but we're going to be talking with a researcher who studies creativity and ways of getting yourself into a creative state by the name of Dr. Adam Galinsky. He will be the interviewee in the main part of this episode, and if you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to give you some good news, assuming you're a smart person. Nice little science-backed piece of good news for the smart set in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. But right now, let's first kick things off with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So for those of you not familiar, laughter is a nonverbal vocal expression that often communicates positive affect and cooperative intent in humans. It sounds something like this. Ha 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 ha. That wasn't a very good laugh, but you probably got the idea. And you probably knew that without me telling you. And it turns out that humans are connoisseurs of laughter. We understand it very well. It's sort of a built-in language for us and conveys information in ways that things like sneezes and hiccups and other human universal non-vocal sounds don't. There was a recent study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of the Sciences, which is abbreviated, by the way, PNAS, P-N-A-S, which every time I see it, I snicker for obvious reasons. But the study was looking at laughter, actually looking at something called co-laughter, which is when two people laugh together, and looking at people's ability to judge when they hear co-laughter, whether the co-laughers in question are friends or strangers. So you're around a corner, you hear two people laughing. Can you tell from that laugh alone whether it's somebody laughing with their best friend or somebody laughing with somebody that they just met? In this study, the researchers asked pairs of American English-speaking undergraduate students to come into the lab and get microphoned and then talk about bad roommate experiences and other things that were likely to get a chuckle. They recorded both of them, and then they just waited for these instances of co-laughter to occur. Now, some of these undergraduates were best friends, very good friends, people that had long history and relationship together. Others were people that just were paired up for this research study and had no knowledge of one another prior. Then the editor spliced out the moments of co-laughter where both people started laughing within 1 second of one another and there was no verbal component to the laughter. Then they took these little co-laughter snippets and they played them for people from all over the world, lots of different cultures. There were a total of 966 laughter listeners from 24 different countries on 5 continents, and people were able to get the correct answer. Do these people know one another or not, just based on the co-laughter? 61% of the time versus 50-50 is what you would expect just based on flip of the coin. As you might imagine, this is a fairly intuitive decision that people make. They're not necessarily sure what they're listening for, but according to the researchers, the way that we laugh with strangers is marked by a shorter length of time for each burst of laughter, and the laughter is more irregular in both pitch and volume. And that 61% accuracy rating, that held fairly constant across cultures, whether or not the people making the decision had any familiarity with English language or not. Laughter, it has been showed in earlier studies, is something that's been fairly well conserved across the great ape family of which humans are a part. Researchers tickling young orangutans and gorillas found that those animals made noises that were very similar to human infant laughter. As for why humans can use laughter as a signal to discern the relationship strength between other people that are laughing, you could kind of see why that would be worthwhile if you came across a new group of people and you wanted to see what the strength of the relationships within that group were like, whether this was a tight-knit tribe that already had their allegiances formed, or whether these people might not know one another very well and there's maybe more room in the pecking order for you to establish yourself. According to the study's authors, these findings strongly suggest that co-laughter is universally perceivable as a reliable indicator of relationship quality, and they contribute to our understanding of how nonverbal communicative behavior might have facilitated the evolution of cooperation.
Smart Drug Smarts, The podcast's so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Joe the Swim Geek from South Africa says, I've been listening to the show for the last 6 months. Great content. And I found the recent show on non-ordinary states of consciousness to be truly brilliant. That was episode number 171, if memory serves. And Sterling44 from the USA says, ever since I found SDS, I have been hooked. SDS helped me to open my mind to new science that academia is often scared of, and also led me to pick up a third major in neuroscience. Well, that is really awesome. There's nothing more disappointing than people that just stop at a double major, right? Thanks to both of you. Thanks to everyone who has left iTunes reviews. And thanks to everybody that's been waving the pom-poms for Smart Drug Smarts in whatever way, shape, or form that you're doing that. This month of March was actually our biggest month ever for downloads, which is not uncommon. Probably about 50% of months are our biggest month ever, which is always nice. But I really appreciate all the overt and covert means, whatever people are doing to spread the word on Smart Drug Smarts. Makes it even more fun than it would otherwise be to put these together. A lot of you might already be subscribed to the Brain Breakfast newsletter, the email newsletter companion piece to Smart Drug Smarts. If you're not, you could easily do so over at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. And if you are, then awesome. One thing that you'll definitely hear in occasional installments of the Brain Breakfast is the kind of stuff that we've got coming up soon. Just let you guys know what's coming down the pike. We've got a lot of great interviews that we've done in the last couple of weeks that have not yet been released. And honestly, we probably won't really have time to release them for another couple of months. Things like the toxicology of modafinil, how snipers keep their head in the game when they're trying to select targets amongst a moving crowd, how advances in virtual reality are helping out psychologists, but why as the future becomes more real around us, some of those technologies might actually start reversing their usefulness as therapies. Got a Know Your Neurotransmitters episode on acetylcholine coming up. All this and more on coming episodes over the course of the spring and summer. Had a big pause in my prolificness on that for a while early in this year, but I'm back on the horse. We had one earlier this week. I think another one coming out in the next day or two. The lovely and talented Miss Rhiannon Rowe is actually the one who presses publish on those, but the content and occasional misspellings I can take credit for myself. One thing I can take only partial credit for, but I'm a big fan of, are the products Nexus and Mitogen, the couple of stacks that we've got over at axonlabs.io. I had some Nexus far earlier this morning. It's probably mostly out of my system by now. Nexus is based around aniracetam. It's got several compounds in there, but the acute spike that you'll feel perceptually is going to probably be in like the 3 to 5 hour range. So at this point, I'm not really feeling that, but the lingering effects, things like neuroprotection, are there for the long term. Both Nexus and its sibling stack Mitogen are available online at axonlabs.io, or you can click over if you're at smartdrugsmarts.com by following the shop link.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So some of you might remember last year we had a April Fool's Day episode. Last year, 2016, April Fool's Day actually fell on the release day for the podcast, and I could not help myself. I did an April Fool's episode that was a completely false, bogus interview. It was interviewing a couple of actors pretending to be people who did not exist. I thought it was hilarious, but there were also a great number of people that were completely confused because podcast not being a real-time medium, it was an April Fool's release, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was listened to on April Fool's. The very next day, I actually put up a differentiated MP3 that had a warning saying, hey, what you're about to hear is fake. But for the people who downloaded the episode on April Fool's and then listened to it later, the die was already cast. There was nothing I could do about that. So April Fool's is tomorrow if you're listening to this on Friday. One of my favorite holidays. This is not an April Fool's episode. What you're about to hear is real, but I did want to do something in this episode that would be at least a hat tip to humor. And a while ago, almost a year ago, I think, I came across the work of Dr. Adam Galinsky and some studies he was doing looking at the intersection of sarcasm and creativity. Sarcasm isn't exactly humor, but it's a kind of humor. It certainly can be funny. And I thought that was a very interesting thing to be studying. It doesn't necessarily seem like sarcasm and creativity would have any direct intersection. So in the coming interview, we're going to be talking about creativity in general, not through any chemical means, but just kind of the psychosocial ways of getting yourself into a creative headspace. We're teeing off the conversation with his work on sarcasm, but we quickly get beyond that. A really interesting conversation coming up with Dr. Adam Galinsky.
I first got interested in sarcasm from watching the movie Midnight Run with Robert De Niro and Charles Grodin. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. But there's a point on their fugitive run across the country where he goes to see his ex-wife and he's in trouble. And she says, today's not a good day for you to show up. And he said, oh, I'm really sorry that my fugitive timetable doesn't coincide with your social calendar. And then you saw this conflict erupt. But I just found that phrase so engaging and so amusing and so insightful. It made me feel like I looked at the world in a slightly different way. So that sort of got me starting to think about this idea that, yes, sarcasm is the foundation oftentimes of misunderstanding and hurt feelings, but maybe there's something about sarcasm that connect us to creativity. And the reason why is for me to interpret a sarcastic message, I need to notice a distinction between the literal meaning and the intended meaning. And knowledge, that psychological realization that there's a difference between what was said and what was intended, is in some ways very similar to what creativity is. Creativity is often noticing that whatever is on the surface might have different meanings or uses, etc. And another example that's unrelated to sarcasm that relates to some of my other work was an experience I had when I lived with a family in Indonesia in the 1980s when I was in high school. And all the people going to Asian countries to live with families all met in Los Angeles. And they talked about some cross-cultural differences in the countries we were going to go to. And one of them was, in China, it's a sign of respect to leave food on your plate because it says you got enough to eat. But in Indonesia, it's a sign of disrespect to leave food on your plate because you're suggesting it wasn't very good. And so what was so fascinating to me was this idea that the same form, food on a plate, could have different meanings and different functions. And again, that really relates to this idea of creativity. And just the final thing I'll say about all this is that really relates to probably the most famous creativity problem of all time. It's called the Dunker candle problem. And the Dunker candle problem is basically you give someone a candle, a box of tacks, and a book of matches. And you say to them, I want you to affix this candle to the wall in such a way that the candle, when lit, doesn't drip wax onto the wall or the floor. Now, I did this study at Princeton University in the 1990s, and only about 10 to 15% of them can solve it within 10 minutes. So these are some of the smartest people. The solution is just like the food and the plate problem. It's basically you have to recognize that one of those forms has multiple functions. And the key solution, if you haven't thought of it already, is you dump all the tacks out of the box. You tack the box to the wall, and then you put the candle inside the box. So the box is not just a repository for tacks. It's also can be used as a stand. Just as food on a plate doesn't have to be an insult, it can also be a compliment.
This almost reminds me of the idea of a joke. A joke in sort of the broadest sense is always setting up one expectation, then defying it with something else. And I guess in the case of sarcasm, it's like what you're defying the expectation with would be the tone of voice almost.
Absolutely. And, we often are sarcastic when we're flirting with someone, right? We jokingly make comments about, let's say, that their dress is awful when we really think it's great.
Right.
And I have an example where I actually used sarcasm to decrease some tension with my wife. When she was not my wife then, we were getting married. We decided to get married. We were going to try to do this wedding in like 6 weeks. And she woke me up in the middle of the night one night, like a month before the wedding. And she can't even remember what it was, just crazy ideas that were going to be logistically impossible and also financially impossible.
Right.
And I said to her, I was like, those are amazing ideas. Why don't we also get Barack Obama to do a benediction, Aziz Ansari to do a little comedy, and maybe get Paul McCartney to come sing a little music? And so, of course, she got that I was joking. I was being sarcastic. And she laughed and she giggled and said, oh, yeah, I guess it's probably impractical. So rather than confronting her directly by shutting her down and saying, that's not a good idea at all, that's ridiculous, or that's impossible, I sort of led her to understand that it was impossible through my sarcastic comment. But that example is also something really important, which is that sarcasm can work to make a connection, increase our creativity when we trust the other person, when we know they have our best intentions.
Right, because you could dance on landmines otherwise.
Yes, otherwise it explodes in your face. And so that's another thing that our research has shown. We've shown that sarcasm leads to conflict. It also leads to creativity, but it leads to creativity without conflict when it's in a very trusting relationship.
Now, when you say leads to, I mean, it's clear that there's some creative thinking going on from the sarcastic party, but does it lead to creative thinking in the party that's having to sort of unwind that, the receiving party?
Yeah, so what's really cool about the research we did is we asked that question, like, where would be the source of sarcastic creativity? Now, you might think it's just in the person who's creating the sarcasm because they have to create the surface message with the intended underlying message. And we actually showed that in our study. So we gave them a little cartoon where a car drove by with a little puddle. And then we told the person on the sidewalk, we said, fill in the bubble of what the person said with a sincere comment or with a sarcastic comment. And then we measured their creativity afterwards. And the people who were asked to create a sarcastic comment did better on a creativity task, like the Dunker candle problem I mentioned earlier. But then in another group of participants, we actually showed showed them the same cartoon, but we had filled it in already with either a sincere comment or a sarcastic comment. And then we asked them to evaluate the cartoon. And then we gave them a creativity measure afterwards. And just understanding the sarcasm was enough to increase creativity. Because again, to appreciate and understand the sarcastic comment required the person to also make that distinction between the underlying intended meaning with the surface meaning.
I'm sure that a lot of people are going to hear about this and say, yeah, sarcasm's all well and good, but I risk pissing somebody off by being sarcastic. Is there like a minimal effective dose of sarcasm that can still get the creativity uptick without risking alienating the people around you?
Well, I think it's exactly the word I used earlier, which is trust. Trust really comes down to, I guess, good intentions. That we know they're saying this because they're not trying to be mean-spirited, but because they're trying to lead me in a direction, but do it with a lighter touch. And so there's a friend of mine told a story once about someone at work, his boss, walking by and seeing that I think he was watching like some cat video and said, "Oh, I see you're working very hard," but he said it with a smile. And that smile indicated that the boss wasn't really mad, but was also saying, maybe you should start working a little bit harder.
Right.
And I think that the smile, the glint in our eye that's suggesting that we have good intentions, those are all things. Now you can imagine the same person saying, "Oh, I see you're working really hard," just dripping with derision, and that's going to have very different effect. And so like with my wife, when she woke up in the middle of the night, I did it with a smile. I did it with a purr in my voice. "Oh, that's a great idea," smiling at her. And so there's really a way to do that. And I think that it's the same thing with flirtation. How do you flirt with someone successfully, right? Well, you've got to do it with the lightest touch so that they know that you mean well and that you have a good intention. You're not trying to hurt their feelings.
Right. Otherwise, it's like a third grade boy flirting where he's actually just being mean.
Yes, exactly. And so I think that type of situation, which is really helpful. I think the other thing, too, is that if you're known for someone who is willing to be the target of sarcasm, that also helps a lot. So I think people often make jokes about me, and I'm pretty good natured. So I think that makes them feel comfortable joking with me, but then also more comfortable receiving sarcastic jokes from me.
I guess you could also probably very safely do some self-directed sarcasm that's not going to risk pissing off anybody else.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. Self-deprecation is often a very quick route to win the hearts of other people.
Let's talk about some of your other studies into creativity and kind of the broad range of things that are available to people that are looking to make themselves more creative or get into a more creative headspace.
Yeah. Again, creativity is often noticing something different. And there's a number of ways that we can get there. So here's one of my lines of research that I think really captures that. It goes back to the example I gave earlier of food on a plate. So earlier I mentioned how Midnight Run got me interested in understanding the link between sarcasm and creativity. That food on a plate story back when I was in high school really led to a whole nother research project 20 years later that I started in my 30s, which was understanding how our experiences in different cultures with different people might also spur our creativity. And so for me, I started to look at food on a plate in a totally different way. I started to have to ask myself a question. What does food on a plate mean where I am today? And I was asked many years ago to do a lecture to 250 MBA students going for 2-week study abroad programs as groups to learn different cultures. And I just asked myself a simple question with my colleague Will Maddox. We asked ourselves this question: do people who have more experience abroad, are they more creative? So we sent out a simple survey and we asked a simple question: how long have you lived abroad in your life? How long have you traveled abroad in your life? And we gave them the Dunker candle problem I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. And we found a correlation. We found that the people who had lived abroad were more creative than the people who hadn't, but there's no effect for travel abroad. So it didn't matter how much you traveled or whether you had traveled abroad, there was no effect on creativity. And that really fascinated us. And actually we've replicated that effect in dozens of studies, where travel abroad on average doesn't have an effect, but lived abroad does. And then we asked ourselves, why? And we realized, well, when you live abroad, you have the motivation and the incentive to really understand why another culture does what they do. That key question of why. Why does food on the plate mean this? And so we just started doing lots of studies. So we found that one of the reasons really led to greater creativity is for those people that were more willing to adapt to their local cultures, to really take on some of the customs while they were abroad, for example.
Did you look at military personnel that were stationed overseas for a long, long time? So I guess technically would have lived abroad, but might not have really gotten out of the cultural bubble, and just kind of seen how that might be confounding?
That is an unbelievably great question. In fact, that question comes up a lot about the military, because sometimes it's like, well, does it matter if they volunteer to go abroad or not, right? That's another question. But we show in our research, for example, that expatriates, so these would not be necessarily military people, but type people who are really separated from the new culture. So they just hang out with Americans in France who only hanging out with other Americans, they don't get the boost of creativity because they're not really engaging with the local culture in any way, integrating into their own understanding of the world. So it really requires this sort of integration of new knowledge. So if we go back to travel, people always ask me, well, can you get a benefit from traveling abroad? Absolutely. But you only get the benefit of traveling abroad is when you're traveling, you really engage and integrate with the local culture.
Yeah.
So someone who lives abroad for 6 months and stays with expatriates and never gets out to local culture will be less creative than someone who travels abroad for 2 weeks, but during that entire 2 weeks, they're really trying to understand the other culture and be really part of it while they're there. And I think that's really the key variable. So let me tell you another cool finding that just got accepted for publication, which I'm very excited by. You don't actually have to even go abroad to get these benefits. You can actually just interact with someone from another culture where you are today. But here's the key thing. It's the same thing with travel versus living. It's the deep experiences that are going to lead to more creativity. So we did a study. We measured people's creativity at time 1, and we measured their creativity a year later. And then we measured at the end of that time 2 period, the year later, about their new relationships they had had in the past year. We measured their friendships and their romantic relationships. And what we found is that their intercultural friendships, so people from other cultures, it didn't have a big increase on creativity. But if they had dated someone from another culture, their creativity increased from time 1 to time 2. Now, why would that be the case? Well, romantic relationships are deeper relationships than friendships. Living abroad is a deeper experience than traveling abroad. And so what you can start to see here is it's really that depth of that experience, how much we learn about other cultures. One other study we did, another longitudinal study with MBA students, we measured their complexity of their thought at time 1 and their complexity of thought at time 2. And we also measured the number of jobs they got when they graduated. And we showed that the more deeply they learned about other cultures while they're at INSEAD, the complexity of their thinking increased, and they walked out of INSEAD with more job offers. And so we can start to see, again, the depth. It goes back to sarcasm. Sarcasm is really leading to a deeper understanding and thinking because you have to go deeper. You have to understand what's underneath the surface meaning to appreciate the intended meaning. And so all of these examples are about depth of thought.
It seems like the differences between cultures could apply to much other than national level cultures. Like, I mean, the culture between working in a highly scientific technical office versus a laid back casual coffee shop is like very, very different corporate culture. I'm not quite sure that that's something that's going to seep into the pores of your being the same way as a romantic relationship would. But again, the difference between like the culture of Texas versus the culture of Seattle is probably pretty different too.
Absolutely. I often realize this with some of the, I teach, MBA students, so all of them have work experience. And I haven't measured this scientifically yet, but this is my intuition based on my experience, is that oftentimes people come in with just one type of work experience. They were a consultant for 5 years. Or they're an investment banker for 5 years. But sometimes people come in and they were a consultant for 2 years and then an investment banker for 3 years, or they worked in tech for 2 years and then they worked in marketing for 3 years. And I really see a more flexibility of thought, the people who have those more varied experience. So diversity of experiences is really one of the most important things. And I just want to tell you one other amazing study that we conducted with some colleagues of mine in France. Frederic Godart was leader of this, but we have 21 seasons of every major fashion house in the world who presented in the top fashion shows in the world in Milan, Paris, London, or New York. And we actually have an objective measure of their creativity. There's a French magazine that asks buyers and journalists to rate the creativity of all the different designs. So this is not a measure we created. And what we found was that when the top executive for design, the creative director, had lived abroad, they were more likely to have produced more creative lines. So there again, you see the foreign experience. But here's the other really fascinating thing that we found from this experience is you wanted different experiences and more different experiences, but only up to a point. For example, if you went to a culturally distant country from your own, so let's say someone going from England to France versus going from, let's say, England to Russia, you got a bigger in creativity if you went to a more culturally distant thing. But if you went to a country that was too culturally distant from you and it was too hard for you to really appreciate it and you didn't spend enough time in that culture, then you actually got a decrease in creativity because it kind of unsettled you. So if you went from Britain to Japan, but you were only there for a few months, you actually had lower creativity because you were so overwhelmed with this different culture. And so we showed that like the cultural distance can sometimes matter too. And if you go from, let's say, Britain to Japan, or if you go from investment banking to the tech industry, you're going to need more time before you can really adapt to that local environment. And so again, we see the depth of experience in interacting with how different the experience is.
I'm wondering if you've teased apart what the importance of human-to-human interaction in that cultural environment versus just being in a place where it's kind of like Gulliver's Travels-esque. The physical world around you works differently. Like I just did a parent-teacher conference yesterday, so I went into this school where everything's scaled down 60% from what you're used to because it's little kids. And I could see where that would be, even just being in that environment for a while would kind of force you to do things a bit differently, even in the absence of other people.
Absolutely. But I think one of the key things that you just showed is what I call sort of a meta understanding of the world. So you walked into this world and it affected you, but you're also aware that you're having this effect. And I think that one of the things that the research shows is that when people go into a new type of experience, what people call learning orientation. So you're going in with that, A, you recognize that things are different, and B, you want to understand why they're different, and C, you appreciate how that understanding is also changing the way that you look at the world. That's when you really get those sort of boost in creativity. And so what you were showing right then was this meta capacity to understand the world's different. I'm appreciating how it's affecting me that the world's different, and I'm trying to understand how that might affect the way that I look at the world differently. And so I think that is such an incredibly important insight. And again, it gets back to depth of thinking, right? That meta-awareness, like with sarcasm. All of these examples, like when you're going abroad, I travel a lot, and based on my own research, it's changed the way that I approach the way that I go abroad. So I was just in Norway last week, and I just ask a lot more questions now. Like, oh, I noticed this happens. Why does it happen this way? And then people have all these examples. Oh, there's a reason why people eat fish this way because of historically it was this way, then it became a custom. And then you're like, oh, that's really cool. And then you start thinking, oh, what are some of the customs I have in my own life? And then that's where you see that integration happening. Let me give you one more line of research I've done that has shown that affects creativity. And it's something that, I've always been really fascinated with in my own life. And I'll even tell you why I got fascinated with it too. I'm a huge UNC basketball fan. And in 1981, UNC lost the national championship to Indiana Hoosiers on the day that Reagan got shot. And I cried that night, and I went to bed that night, and I kept thinking in mind, if they'd only postponed the game to the next day, maybe Carolina would have won. And that's what's called counterfactual thinking. We start thinking about the world, how it might have turned out differently. And what my research shows is that when you get people to think counterfactually, they actually become more creative. And I'll tell you the little scenario that we're given in our studies. We have people read a little scenario about a person at a rock concert, and we say a trip to Hawaii is going to be one that's based on the seat you're currently sitting in. And we have this person, Jane, and she's sitting in a seat and it wins, or she's sitting in a seat and it doesn't win. And so one time you have a positive or negative outcome. But then we have two other conditions. We say Jane moves seats to get a better view of the stage, and the new seat she just moved to won. Or we say Jane moves seats to get a better view of the stage, and the seat she had been sitting in won. Now, you imagine that people feel lots of joy whenever she moved and she won, because she can easily imagine, if I had moved, I wouldn't have won. And you can imagine she feels lots of pain when she moved and her old seat won, because if she had moved, she would have won. We found it doesn't matter. Both of those scenarios increase people's creativity because in both cases, again, they're thinking more deeply, more complexly about the world. They're understanding a relationship between reality and alternative reality. Just like sarcasm, they're understanding a relationship between what was said but what was intended, right? Just like foreign experience, they're understanding about what someone did but why they did what they did. And so we've shown in our research that this sort of counterfactual thinking gets people to engage in more deep, complex thinking, and that leads them to become temporarily more creative.
You know what that kind of reminds me of is the Magic Eye posters from the 1990s, where you could kind of look past the depth of the actual piece of paper and see a hidden image, but you couldn't see both the surface of the paper and the hidden image at the same time. You kind of had to pick which depth you focused your eyes at, but both things were there if you looked the right way.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think, again, it's that psychological process of recognizing something and then recognizing the alternative to that, recognizing that it has a different visual experience when you look at it differently. And I think that is really the foundation of creativity, is looking at the world in a different way and being more creative in the process of thinking about that world.
I forget where I originally read this. You'll probably know this off the top of your head, but creativity kind of subdivides into these two fundamental pieces, one of which is coming up with a bunch of new and novel ideas, and the other is selecting the good ideas from the probably larger number of bad ideas that you've come up with. In these interventions that we've been talking about to get more creative, have you looked at which of those two facets are actually getting dialed up? Is it just helping with this proliferation of new potential ideas, or is it actually helping to select the worthwhile needles from the much larger haystack?
So I think there's two different ways, the distinctions in creativity. So one is what we might call the novelty of the ideas versus the usefulness of the ideas. And then the other one is what people call divergent thinking versus convergent thinking. And divergent thinking is just thinking of lots of different ideas. Convergent thinking is coming up with that sort of one creative solution. So for example, a divergent thinking task would be come up with different uses for cardboard box or brick. And so we can code those, the number of ideas, the number of different types of ideas, the creativity of those ideas. The Dunker-Campbell problem is called a convergent task because there's one right answer and you have to have that insight in order to get that sort of one right answer. And generally, what I found in my research is a lot of these different stimuli to creativity, or catalysts to creativity, I guess is a better word, work on both convergent and divergent thinking. So sarcasm leads to both better divergent and convergent thinking. So does living abroad. Counterfactual thinking is a little different. Counterfactual thinking actually helps with convergent thinking, where you're able to get that one right answer, but it doesn't help you as much with divergent thinking, because what counterfactual thinking is sometimes do is focusing you on this sort of one alternative reality and how it relates to that other reality. Now, in terms of the difference between what we might call the novelty of the ideas versus the usefulness of the ideas, I actually haven't done as much work on that. The one case where we have some evidence that it works at both levels is with the fashion designers. So they not only had to come up with that creative design, but it had to be seen as creative by other people and seen useful by them. And so we saw that for those cases, we call those sort of creative innovations because they actually got implemented, that those foreign experiences that I mentioned tend to increase the implementation of those creative ideas. But I think it's a really important point, and you can imagine, when are people good at creating ideas versus when are they good at picking the best ideas? And I think it's a really important point. I just haven't done as much research myself on that distinction.
For the people that are listening that are interested in applying some of these ideas but aren't necessarily able to pluck themselves up from their life and live abroad for a couple of years, what are some of the maybe more life low impact ways of applying some of these ideas?
It's a great thing. I mean, I think the example that we have of dating and friendships, it goes back to that difference between living abroad and traveling. You don't have to date someone from another culture to get these benefits. It's just when you have a friendship, you have to go a little bit deeper with that person. So you want to understand their culture and understand some of the reasons why maybe they do things the way that they do. I've noticed that you do X. Is that something that's part of your culture? Why is that part of your culture? I guess what I would say is curiosity is really the foundation of creativity. It's just becoming more curious about the world, wondering why do people walk this way versus that way down the street in this city versus another city. Noticing those differences like you did in your Gulliver's Travels to your parent-teacher conference with all the small little things. It's just taking a curious approach to the world, being willing to ask questions, not just noticing the surface, but trying to understand the underlying reason behind things, playing with ideas, even just in your own mind, like counterfactually. How would the world have been differently if I'd gone to a different school than the undergraduate program that I went to? That's one of the manipulations we've used. We ask people, how did you end up at Northwestern? Or we ask all the ways how you might not have ended up at Northwestern. And then, we see that people have a different, deeper sort of cognitive perspective after thinking that counterfactual thinking. I mean, we've actually shown that it makes people's connections more deep. If you think about all the ways you might not have met your spouse, you actually feel more connected to your spouse. So I think it's really at this cognitive level. Now, these experiences help us, and maybe trying some more flirtatious jokes. Being more playful, more curious. I guess it's playful curiosity with the world, I think, is the key foundation to increasing creativity.
Do you find that there's any relationship between creativity and anxiety? Because a lot of the things we've talked about is sort of seeing the world in different ways. I could see that as also making the world seem kind of less fixed and orderly, and in some people it could kind of be an anxiety-causing state.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of data out there. There's two routes to creativity emotionally. So this is a lot of work that I haven't done, but other people have done. Some great work by Karsten de Drew and people in the Netherlands, that we can become creative through when we're happy, and that creativity from happiness just allows us to think in a broader, more diffuse way. But we can also become more creative when things aren't going well because we know the world isn't right, and it's telling us that we need to think differently, and we need to activate sort of some more deeper systematic thinking. So positive emotions are the route to broader thinking. Negative, sort of a little bit of anxiety, can be the route towards deeper thinking and some of those solutions. That's like people like struggling, scratching their head, trying to come up with something in that way, I think is really important. One other thing that I just want to say that research has shown about creativity, which I think is also really important, and this is one of these small life hacks that you can do. And I have to say, I didn't do this research, but it changed my life and it's transformed a number of things. The way that I actually run my meetings as chair now of my department, I'm chair of the management division at Columbia, is that taking a break and coming back to something after you've taken a break is very powerful, sleeping on something. So I instituted a new idea this year in my department, which is we don't make decisions the day we discuss a decision. We sleep on it and then we make the decision the next day. And because people sleep really helps people process information, come back and think about it in a new way and in a more deep way. People have shown that you don't learn if you don't sleep. So the idea of staying up all night and taking an exam, you're better off staying up and getting 2 hours of sleep than you are all night, because sleep helps consolidate some of your learnings and your information.
The sleep advice is something that seems like it's coming from all directions nowadays. At what an underslept culture we are in the multiplicity of ways that it's screwing us up.
Well, one thing I don't know about the sleep researchers, they've really shown that 8 hours is going to make you learn better than 6 hours. The research I know is just that getting some sleep before getting tested leads to better performance than getting no sleep.
Right. I think there's also mood benefits and things like that, which are hard to quantify back to strict cognition, but it certainly makes it more enjoyable to go through life.
Yeah. I mean, I just think just reiterating some of the points. I talked to you about the benefits of sarcasm for creativity, the benefits of foreign experiences and romantic relations with someone with another culture. I talked to you about counterfactual thinking, about thinking about alternatives and ways things could have been differently. All of them are about depth of thinking more deeply about the world. And I think we saw with your example of Gulliver's Travel, when we approach the world willing to notice differences, but also thinking about how those differences might make a difference, that's when we really spur ourselves on. So just to be aware of your world, be aware of how things are different, try to understand why they're different, be playful, be curious, be flirtatious, be all these things, and you will be more creative.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big, sincere, and absolutely non-sarcastic thank you to Dr. Adam Galinsky for taking the time for that conversation. Despite the fact that this is a show that has drugs in the title, I love little mental sleight of hand tricks like that, where just getting yourself in the proper headspace through something like sarcasm can have a follow-on effect with creativity. It's one of those things that you would almost never think of, but once somebody points it out to you, you're like, oh yeah, that actually does make quite a bit of sense. If you can think of other examples of strange psychological bedfellows, things like this that you want to bring to my attention, I definitely consider such topics episode worthy. So drop me an email, jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com. If you're listening to this on the day of publication, tomorrow is April Fool's, so burn a little bit of brain glucose, coming up with some creative and funny ideas for what you might be able to do to spoof your friends and family. Such efforts are never wasted. And also never wasted is our final opportunity in the episode to sneak in one little weird piece of neuroscience trivia into the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So I always assume that it's a fairly smart crowd of listeners who are listening to this show. Based on the people that I speak with and the emails that I get, probably a great deal of confirmation bias as well. Leaving that aside, we'll assume that you, listener, are smart. But along with smartness, we are all probably interested in being happy. And social scientists at Indiana University recently did a meta-analysis of over 33 papers with 50,000 participants looking to see, are smarter people happier, are smarter people less happy? There's a couple of truisms like ignorance is bliss, only fools can be happy. Are these ideas true, or are smart people smart enough to find ways to be happy as well? And the good news is, on average, smarter people are a little bit happier, statistically significant, although the level of impact of the numbers is not huge. There are still plenty of smart, miserable people and plenty of very happy, very dumb people, but overall the correlation is there. Smartness and happiness do go together more often than not. The way that they performed this meta-analysis was looking at job satisfaction and life satisfaction, which might be why this was published in the Journal of Vocational Behavior. Higher intelligence had indirect links with greater happiness because more intelligent people tend to earn more, which increases job satisfaction, but also because they tend to have more complex jobs, which presumably are somewhat more psychologically rewarding. However, there is an interesting little dark cloud hidden in the silver lining of this data, which is that when the researchers held job complexity and income constant, they actually found then that higher intelligence correlated with less job satisfaction, which put another way means if you're doing the same job as somebody else, you're earning the same amount of money and you're smarter, you would tend to be less happy with your job, which kind of makes sense if you're looking over at the next guy and you're earning the same money doing the same job as he is, and yet you know you're smarter. That might be frustrating. Now, this meta-analysis being what it is, it's a cross-sectional study. These data are being pulled from lots of different studies, and this can only look at correlation, not direct causality. So what they can't see here is whether intelligence is causing changes in either life satisfaction or job satisfaction, or perhaps it's the other way around. Maybe being very satisfied with your life allows you to develop your intelligence more.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, you heard it. That was the entire episode, number 174, our last episode in the month of March. If you missed last week's episode number 173, I spoke with Dr. Chris Kresser about omega-3 fatty acids, fish oil, and some of the reasons why you might want to consider getting your fish oil from a fish directly rather than through supplementation. And next week in episode number 175, we're going to be talking with a couple of interviewees about the effects of light on the human brain. A lot of therapies and interventions now starting to make use of light. And actually something that we rarely do, but it's going to be coming up in next week's episode, is a couple of giveaways, actual physical objects being given away to a couple of lucky Smart Drug Smarts listeners. Either way, I will see you back here next week, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.